Hey all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I'm one of your hosts, Austin, also known to Teacup, who totally did not forget until this moment that I am the person who introduces this show.
Okay. I mean, we did take a break, so I guess there's that for like a week. But anyway, I'm She-Cup. I'm your co-host. I'm excited to be here. This is a really special episode of the Lorecast today. And we're just really pumped. We have a ton of guests with us. And we're talking about elves, as you may have guessed from the title of this episode. So I'll just let you guys go around the room and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Ben of Temeria. I am one of the hosts for the Witcher Lorecast.
Hi, I'm Aaron, or the Allmightycrit, and I host a lot of shows. You'll find out about it at the end. I'm not going to go through a 20-minute rant now.
Hi, I'm Allison, Allisondraste on all my socials. I don't have a podcast, but I do frequent this one. I think this is my third time on, so I'm glad to be back.
Hi, I'm Collcashins or Cash, and I also do not have a podcast, but this is one of my favorite podcasts, so I like to join in whenever I have the opportunity.
And as you know, I am Austin or Teacup, and for this episode, I actually get to not be the main host of the episode, and I get to be on the round table.
Yes, you do. So everybody's going to kind of go around and we'll all talk about our specific fandoms. But first, I kind of want to do a little bit of an introduction to this episode where we're talking about elves. Our group chat is called We Love Elves because we're just talking about everything, all of our fandoms. They all have elves. And so we wanted to talk about how they're different, how they're similar, who does it best? Maybe we will get into a little bit of discussion on that one. We're just breaking down everything there is to know about Dragon Age elves, the Witcher elves, D&D elves, Legend of Zelda elves, Lord of the Rings elves, Inheritance Cycle elves, and Elder Scrolls elves. So before we jump into everybody's brought a specific fandom. Before we jump into all of that information, I want us to give a little bit of background information about like where do elven ideologies come from? Like, where did that idea start? So there are some real world connections. You may not know that. But the first mention of elves and elven races that we know of in our world comes from Germanic and Norse cultures and mythologies. And the first mention of elves that we know of comes from the Icelandic Poetic Edda circa 1000 and Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda circa the year 1200. So it goes way back, like we're talking 1,000 years plus. So that's pretty significant. And so during this time, elves were basically thought of as like part of the Norse pantheon. And they were often associated with several different things, including illnesses, magic, beauty, and seduction. So that's kind of a wide-ranging group of things that they're kind of associated with. But that's how it kind of exists in the Norse pantheon. And then in the 1800s, we have like Christmas elves emerging with myths of Santa. We're pretty familiar with that, I think. And then Lord of the Rings in the 20th century, 1900s, is really the beginning of like the high fantasy genre, featuring different types of elves, which I will let Collcashins speak to later. But those are just some important places that elves show up in our world outside of the fandom that I think is good background information. So let's talk about our fandoms. Is there anybody who wants to talk about their specific fandom of elves first? I'm going to take the question back because I'm going to call on Collcashins because I feel like repping Lord of the Rings like is kind of the foundational knowledge. So I am going to actually ask you to go first, please.
That's fine. So I agree with Shelby. I think that Tolkien kind of took elves and morphed them in this traditional sense of idea of elves and morphed it into something a little bit different. I once read that Tolkien's depiction of elves as these, ethereal, graceful, sublime beings was a departure from standard depictions of elves at the time. I will also concede that I do not have as great of a historical knowledge of the depiction of elves. But I believe what I'd read was kind of there might have been a little bit of like combining or combination or similar traits between like elves and kind of like gnomes and stuff like that. You didn't have these like very tall, agile beings, but were a little bit more like small tricksters and things. So in the Lord of the Rings, the elves were in the universe. The elves were the first race that was created. They were the first of the children of Eru or of God. Tolkien elves they're different from men, obviously, but in the sense that they are closer to the divine, might be a better way of saying it. There's this idea that the Tolkien god imbued as special like fire or spirit in the elves that tied them to the land, and that is both what gives them their immortality, it gives them their grace, it gives them their beautiful sublime gifts. As a fun little fact though, in the sense that elves are immortal, that immortality begins to stretch. I love the phrase stretch like too little butter over bread. If an elf doesn't go back to the undying lands, to the realms of the gods and things, and that they were to stay in Middle Earth after the Fourth Age and onward, they actually like their body dies, but their spirit endures and it continues on because it is bound to the land. There's this eschatological idea in Tolkien's work that when men die, their spirits go elsewhere, then nobody knows what happens to them, and that is their special gift. But the elves, they continue on, as I've said. So Tolkien elves, they reach maturity around 50 years old. Around this time as well, they will most often marry. Elves who do not marry or that marry later on in life are seen as peculiar, odd, and often have twisted fates. Tolkien elves also, they only marry once. They will usually only have a certain number of kids, and then they're just done. Like it could be one, it could be two, three, it could be more, but after like that initial kind of period, they're done, which kind of solves the immortality population question there. If their spouse dies, they do not remarry. Elves are very, I want to phrase this, not sacrosanct, but are very, very pure. It is wholly against an elf's nature to commit like sexual assault against another elf. If an elf suffers or is the victim of sexual assault, it can just outright kill them, even if they suffer no other physical injury. As we know, they can do a little bit of magic. It's not in the same type of magic as we see everywhere else, but I also think that's just Tolkien's system of magic and the elves working within that. They can create these wonderful magical objects. As we know, they can create the they can create rings of power. They can exert that power to preserve, to endure, to heal. They can summon, waters. They can walk on snow. It's a limited, they can see the future and the past. It's a limited amount of magic. It's not the grand, scale of magic as we might see elsewhere. But it's more a sense of like less is more. So different elves. In Tolkien's mythology, elves don't, there's not different races of elves, but they do have different, they call them sunderings. So initially, like elves were all born at this one lake right at the beginning, and it's dark. The sun and everything hasn't been created yet. It's just the stars, and then they start traveling. They start traveling west to get to the Undying Lands, and then along the way they start breaking up into these other groups, and then the ones that do not make it to ever see the Undying Lands, those are called the Avari. And then the ones that do make it to the Undying Lands, those are called the Eldar. And then even within there, you have a breakdown into to how quickly other groups get there. The first are the Vanyar. They are the closest of the gods. They are the most associated with like light and poetry. And you have the Noldor, which are the main elves that we will see in Middle Earth in the actual Lord of the Rings works, like Galadriel is a Noldor, Elrond is a Noldor, and then there are the Teleri, who are the shipbuilders and the singers, the lover of birds, and then because they are so long lived, these sunderings happen over such long periods of time that as they begin to get separated, like they develop completely different languages. And then eventually when Noldor go back to Middle Earth, like we see in the Rings of Power, then they reunite with some of the older tribes of elves. That's where we come in with the Sylvan and the Sindar. And it creates a little bit of a hierarchy. Usually the elves that are the oldest, they are the ones with the most power. They are the most respected. The elves that actually reach the Undying Lands, they have much more power than those who never made it. They are owed more respect. And they're also kind of a little bit snooty to those that never made it over there in the first place, or their ancestry doesn't flow through that line. Which is a little bit classist, almost. It kind of sucks, but it is what it is within this world. As far as their religion, they don't worship, the gods in the sense that we might see in other fandoms. Even though they know these gods are real, they can interact with them. There are a lot of elves that have interacted essentially with the equivalent of angels, and I've studied at the feet of angels or at the feet of the gods, but they still don't worship them in the sense that we see elsewhere. With regard to governance, they usually have kings or lords of some kind. It usually flows. Is it primogeniture, where it flows through the male line primarily, rather than like we see this in the lore in the Rings of Power, where Gil-galad is the High King, even though Galadriel is his aunt and she is thousands of years older than him. But he's still giving her some directions there, which is kind of bullshit. But again, but beyond that, we don't really see a lot of other kind of governance systems among the elves. Their societies, their buildings, basically how they interact with all of the world. It's with great focus on having synergy with nature and not overpowering it, living in harmony with everything else, and bringing out the best of their own nature, and that in turns enriches the land around them and just fills it with beauty. But yeah, does anybody have any questions on Tolkien elves?
My brain hurts. No, it was good. I did like that. That was really in depth. I liked it.
Yeah, thank you, Cash.
I guess I'll go next.
Sure, go ahead.
So elves in The Witcher are very kind of similar to Tolkien elves, but they are still vastly different. So elves in The Witcher, on what we know as the continent where The Witcher takes place, they are one of the elder races. So they're one of the species that lives on the continent well before humans, along with dwarves and gnomes. But they actually came well after the dwarves and gnomes. They are the original conquerors of the continent and whatnot. They live for about 400 years. There are also two sects of different elves in the Witcher universe. You have the Anshe, which are the elves that we see throughout the books, throughout the games, the ones that we normally interact with on a regular basis. And there is the Anel, which are elves from a completely different universe. They are the elves that are from a different world, different universe entirely, to where they actually conquer other worlds. And they are the elves that we see as the Wild Hunt, that you see in the books, that we see in the third game, those elves. And elves in the Witcher universe they do use magic, but just like any other human or any other being in the Witcher universe, not all elves have the adaptability to use magic. So there are some elves that you'll see just using, like, they're very skilled in archery, very skilled in art and magic, but if they're not skilled in that magic, they use their talents elsewhere, typically in field work or archery, swordsmanship, and all that. As far as, like, appearances, they're very typical. They're about 2 meters tall, so about 6 feet, pointy ears, typically what you would see on a traditional fantasy elf. As far as cultural differences, elves believe they have been created, not by evolution like humans typically do. They emphasize heavily on nature. They want to be with nature and surround themselves with it. But there are elves who do live in urban environments, which their urban environments actually affect their culture. So, like, urban elves typically are more scholarly and artistic, whereas elves that live out in, like, the wilderness are more towards the nature aspect and magic and folklore and stuff like that. Typically, they don't live amongst humans. They try to keep themselves separate from Nordlings and humans themselves due to very high problems between the two. And their language is actually part of the Elder speech. So they speak a different form of language with elves, or with gnomes and the dwarves. And with that, they can talk in their own tongue without any human knowing what the heck they're talking about. And then as far as technology goes, they're very castles, forts, and all that you see in medieval times typically on that end. They have a specific type of bow that is much lighter than a standard, like, longbow or short bow that humans make, but they shoot like over 120 yards further than the human bow. And as for their society, on their arrival of the continent, they try to stay away from most other settlements and kept to themselves. Our architecture was very golden, strong structures. In the first book of The Witcher, The Last Wish, you hear their homeland was made of gold and fields and golden towers all over the place. And as far as their religion, they worshipped a deity similar to Melete, which is a goddess of harvest and fertility. But as far as religion, we don't know, because by the time we actually see elves, they want to kill all humans. So it's The Witcher. It's all dark. It's there's no happy endings.
So that kind of picks up on a question I had for you. Now, in Tolkien's universe, like, elves are the top of the top. Like, they're the top of the pyramid, I feel like. Whereas in The Witcher and Dragon Age, let me preface this by saying I haven't played a single Witcher game. I've just seen the first season of the TV show. So I may have completely off base here, because I know the TV show is, like, lore inaccurate. But I get the picture from The Witcher that, along with Dragon Age, elves are in a more oppressed state in those fandoms and in those worlds.
Yes, by the time when the humans make the first landing on the continent, they essentially destroy everything of the elves and the elder races, and the elves become a lower class citizenship, I guess you could say. If non-human in the Witcher universe is strictly looked down upon and subjugated to many cruel acts and even death for no apparent reasons.
I think since we already started talking a little bit about Dragon Age,
Yes.
I can go next. So what I will say about Dragon Age elf lore is that there are some contradictory pieces because of all of the retconning that has kind of happened between Dragon Age Origins and Inquisition. So I'm going to talk about what is largely true. Similar to kind of in The Witcher, elves are thought of to be one of the first beings to have been created. They lived in an empire called Arlithon, and they were immortal. They were bound to the Fade, and they had all of these very magical, ethereal qualities, including magical, ethereal buildings that floated in the air, just very, very high fantasy kind of stuff. And then something happened. We're still not entirely clear on what that something was. Based on who you hear tell it within the universe, it varies. But basically something happened, and the Fade kind of got separated from the physical reality, and it's Solas's fault, but it got separated, and so that fundamentally changed what elves were, because they, like their architecture and their world, were attached to the Fade. And so as we are introduced to elves in the games, they are very oppressed. They're very oppressed. They're probably the bottom rung of the totem pole in a really bad situation. There are two main subtypes of elves. There are some other variations, but you see the Dalish elves, who are the elves who live in clans in the woods. They are trying desperately to hold on to what few traditions they have left, and hold on to very minimal traditions and lore, and worship their pantheon called the Evenurus. And they are kind of prejudiced against other elves. They don't believe that other elves are as good, and they wear valisline, so facial tattoos that are representative of their gods, which we later find out is something else. Ancient slave markings. But that's what they're doing, and they live apart from society. They don't like outsiders, don't like humans, don't like dwarves, don't like other elves. And then you have I guess the best way to describe them is city elves. They don't all necessarily live in cities, but they're assimilated. They have either chosen to for their own safety or been forced to assimilate to human culture. And they tend to live in alienages, which are very impoverished areas of the city. They are mistreated. They are abused. They are, they're servants. And that's in Ferelden. In Tevinter, they're slaves. We learn a lot more about the city elves, and there are city elves in all the games. In Dragon Age 2, they're also mistreated in the free marches, and they have their own culture. They have a tree that is in the middle of their village, in the middle of the alienage. Vinadal, or something like that, yes. I think it means tree of the people. And they don't even really know what it means. They just have them because it's significant to their past. You also have ancient elves. So we see those in Dragon Age Inquisition. Solas is an ancient elf. You have Abeloth, the various other ones that you run into, who are just really long-lived. They reach back into Arlithon times. And so that's a category. And then you also have what I am calling, they're really half-elves, but in Dragon Age lore, they are humans. They don't have any elven qualities except for the blood. So I'm calling them elf-blooded humans, but they're really half-elves. They're also a category that is treated differently if people know that they have elf blood. Elves are not allowed to hold public office. They're not allowed to have any kind of position of power in human society. at least not publicly, or they may do some work behind the scenes, but by and large, they're not allowed into those roles. They the only exception is in the Circle of Magi, which is its own can of worms, but they may hold some positions of power there. Physical differences. Elves are smaller and more lithe than humans, at least the ones who are not ancient. They tend to be petite. They tend to have larger, rounder eyes. And in Dragon Age 2, they don't have a dip between their eyebrows and their nose. It's just straight down, which is an Elven feature that we see in some elves in the game. Lifespan. So the ancient elves, as I already mentioned, were immortal. It is believed that Elven lifespans have shortened as they've lived in the physical world. Dalish elves believe that it is the proximity to humans that have caused what they call the quickening. That's why their word for humans is Shimlin. It means quick children. That's why Dalish are really withdrawn from society, because they believe that it's shortening their lifespans. And so then you have some elves who believe that, they're living longer. A lot of the times that's related to some maybe unsavory magic, but extend their lifespan. But by and large, elves have a similar lifespan to humans and dwarves in the Dragon Age universe. I think I hit the high points. There's just a lot. So if there's anything I need to answer or add.
I would just add that like the pantheon of the Evanuris, like I guess we don't really know if they're really gods or if they were just really powerful elven mages back in the day. So I would sum it up with it's complicated.
Yeah, and that was something else I had in my notes that I forgot to mention. Ancient Arlithon was an empire, and the elves had slaves also. They oppressed each other, and so it kind of feels like their offspring, their descendants are being punished for the crimes of the ancients, but in reality, even the ancient elves don't acknowledge modern elves as their own kind. They're not true elves. So it's complicated.
I got this. You ready for this?
You got it.
I'm not going to speak as many big words as everyone else. I'm not smart as everybody else in this room. So get ready for this. So, no, what we're going to talk about is Legend of Zelda first, specifically the Hylians. Get it out there right now for all you Legend of Zelda fans listening. They're not elves. What are they doing in the elf episode? Okay, that's a great question. Here's your answer. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of the Legend of Zelda series, was inspired by Tolkien elves to create the Hylians. That's actually going to go into the D&D side of things as well, but we're gonna kick it off with the Legend of Zelda first. So, real quick, not much of a difference between the Hylians and humans. Life expectancy anywhere between 50 to 100 years. Magic and technology is not much different than any other fantasy where you'll have stone and metal, and we got magic. We don't know what it does, but we got it. That's Hylians for you. Short, sweet, simple, to the point. The reason they're here is to show you an example of how impactful elves have been to several different franchises. Even if we don't call them elves, they got pointy ears and soft facial features. Okay, that is the typical elf across the franchises. So that being said, we're going to do a nice jump over to the D&D side of things. This is where we're going to get our real elves. So, yes, Tolkien's elves, massively impactful. You know what's assisted that, though? D&D elves. Most video game franchises to date will utilize more of the building blocks that D&D has established over the years than that of the Tolkien. And it is because what Gary Gygax did with the elves was expanded upon them in such a great way. We're talking, we don't just have elves. We have wood elves. We have high elves. We have drow. We have sea elves. You got an elf? We got a place where it goes. Elves, come down to the store. We got them all. this is what Gary Gygax has done for our elves. Now, we would be remiss to say that Tolkien didn't start that. Tolkien deserves a massive line of credit here for creating the elves that we know and love today. But let's jump into some distinguishing features between our Tolkien elves and our D&D elves. So the first thing off the bat is the physical differences. So Tolkien elves are portrayed as beautiful. They're the illustrious locks, and they're higher than everyone else. This is not what you get in D&D. In fact, the player's handbook will tell you in D&D that elves, though they look at other races as they are somewhat beneath them, they don't treat them this way. Most elves will actually look to other races and look in ways that they can assist them to be equal. They also look at other races, such as dwarves, and they say, well, the dwarves do what we don't want to do and really can't do. We're majestic, we're graceful, we're light on our feet, and you ain't going to see any of us picking up a pickaxe and going through the mines. So they've actually created trade routes and different sorts of trade with them. And this has helped the elves because that jumps us into our technology for the elves. The elves use a lot of metal work, but they don't mind for it. So this is how they're getting it. And the metal they use is more of the, shall we say, magical or rare metals. We're talking mithril. We're talking adamantite. We're talking all of these grand exotic metals that really they're not going to take the time to find because it's 60 million feet deep, and we're not going that far, especially with pickaxes. With all of this being said, the technological advances they utilize, their cities are elegant. They're elegant design. They're using more gold. They're using more silvers. Their items, their weapons, their armor, they're sought after by other races for the elegance and the quality and the craftsmanship. And this is where we really dive into what makes the D&D elves what they are. They don't do well with physical labor, but they do excellent in the magic department. They summon creatures. They tame beasts. They create the most magnificent and elegant, just magical items. They have armor that is made out of leaves that just turns you into a pile of leaves. I mean, come on. These things are incredible, but this comes back to their heritage. D&D elves were not from the material plane like other races. D&D elves were from the Feywild originally. And what happened here is in the Feywild, they were almost eternal. They almost had like this recycling life cycle kind of deal. They'd die, they'd be reborn, but they would live for eons. They'd live forever. And they only died if they chose to die. It was really kind of this great life for them. However, after the fall of one of their gods, their god, the god for them, they kind of lost contact, and they wanted to go out into the world and try to find their deity. Well, this brought them to the material plane. And once they got here, much like we have with the Tolkien elves, we're getting back to this now, huh? They lost a lot of their Feywild attachments and started to become mortal in a sense. So their life expectancy drastically dropped. Though they still live longer than any other race in D&D, their life expectancy is well over 700 years. So I think the oldest recorded living elf was 900 and something years old. It's still a substantial amount of time, but it's a lot less than what they used to have. So with that being said, they also got taken away from their original magic, because in the Feywild, they weren't known as elves. They were known as Eladrin, which Eladrin is still in the D&D player's handbook today, and you can play as one if you want, but an Eladrin is different from an elf because they're in tune with nature. When their emotions change, their features will change. They reflect the seasons based on their emotions. Anger and excitement and just the thrill of the chase is summer. They have this burning heat, this red aura, this orange aura. They're just burning. Spring, happy, go lucky, yay, bubbles. Winter is cold, disheartened, downtrodden, just miserable. It's your winter. And your autumn is kind of this in between, this solemn seasoned warrior, if you will. you're seasoned about the world. They reflect themselves in this nature. But all of this was lost once they decided to descend to the mortal realm. Subtypes, there is a list as long as my arm. My personal favorite is the sea elves because it's awesome. They're elves that live underwater and they do awesome, cool water stuff. You can't get any cooler than that. But the primary ones that everyone thinks of when they think of D&D, you have your elves. These are your run-of-the-mill, you see them everywhere kind of, these are the ones that are in the cities. You have your high elves. Your high elves are the ones that kind of, they're hoity-toity. We have more pure blood than the rest of the mongrels, but we will still assist you because, that's who we are. We're better than you, but we're nice. We're polite about it. You're not though. Then you have the drow. The drow are the ones that are most drastically known and drastically different than the rest of the elves in the series. The drow are your evil elves. These are the ones that, when losing their god, they chose another. And the god they chose was a dark and twisted deity. They live in the Underdark, the depths, the dark, the dreary. These are the ones nobody really likes to see. That's changed over the years because of the way Wizard of the Coast has evolved. And they're like, okay, that's kind of bad. That's like segregation, and we don't do that anymore. But that is where they originally came from. They're the dark elves. They're the bad elves. They live in the caves, and we don't talk to them. They murder everyone. And then you have your wood elf. This is the one that everyone immediately draws to. These are the ones that are more reflective of the Tolkien elves more than any other elf. These are elves that live in the woods. They're the ones more attuned with nature, the druidic, the ones that, the herbs, the spices, the city scares me. It intimidates me. I'll go there if I have to, but can't we just gather nuts in the woods and go talk to the squirrels? And these are your wood elves. I'm not really doing the elves in D&D justice with all of this, because in order to talk about the D&D elves, we'd be here forever. I mean, you could literally, and I have done an entire episode, hour and 45-minute episode on elves themselves, and still had more to talk about. But in a nutshell, this is them. This is the D&D elf. This is what you've grown up with if you're a D&D nerd. Nothing I've said here has really surprised you, I'm sure. The one thing I do want to leave you with, though, is Gary Gygax built the D&D game off of Lord of the Rings. So there's going to be a lot of reflections of the elves in the Tolkien universe. But he twisted them because he wanted to build a system in where he could experience these grand Lord of the Ring battles in a more smaller scale system. So he had to change things and evolve things and change the story a bit. But that's all I have for you. That's D&D elves. There you go. And then, okay, the Hylians, but, they're not elves, so we're not going to talk about them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. We play D&D every week, and I feel like I learned something. So thank you so much. All right. Austin, you're the last one.
All right. So I'm going to talk about two fandoms. Now, I'm glad you talked about this influence D&D has had, because one of the fandoms I'm going to talk about is heavily influenced by the D&D world. And the other one is heavily influenced by the Tolkien world. And so I'm going to start with the D&D one because of that. So I'm going to talk briefly about Elder Scrolls. Now, I want to preface this by saying I am not an expert on Elder Scrolls lore. I know, as I say, I know enough to be dangerous. If you want a very great comprehensive covering on Elder Scrolls lore, I highly recommend the Elder Scrolls Lorecast and Aramithius's Written in Uncertainty podcast. One thing that kind of situates physical differences, they vary in size between which subspecies of elves you're talking about. Elves, is it really the right term when you're talking about Elder Scrolls elves? The term you want to use is mer. So there's mer and man in Elder Scrolls. And so mer is really that. And the mer are divided into 4 categories that we get. 6 really, but we've got the Dunmer, which are sometimes called Dark Elf. You've got the Orzamer, which are orcs. The Altmer, which are what you think of High Elves. The Bosmer, which are the Wood Elves. Now, these are your 4 playable races that you can have in the Elder Scrolls. There are additional ones that say, which are the Falmer, and then the Maomer, which are also said to have been elves. Um, but they tend to be different. They vary in size depending on which subspecies you're going to talk. But all of them tend to have like long, kind of horse-like faces. They tend to have slanted, angled eyes that sometimes tend to be close together. Another distinguishing feature, but it depends on which game you're playing. But if we take Elder Scrolls 5, they don't have pupils. Like they have just solid colored eyes, which is really kind of interesting in there. But one thing that I think is unique with that kind of points to this point of Tolkien's influence, even in the Elder Scrolls, because let's be honest, all of us are influenced by Tolkien. He's the first. He's the first one who does it. There's no elf lore that you're going to get out there other than if you consider Norse mythology that's not influenced by Tolkien. In Elder Scrolls, the elves are inherently tied to the deities of Tamriel and Nirn and everything around there. And so the deities of Tamriel and Nirn and everything are divided into 2 categories, roughly speaking. Again, this is an overview. There are more deities outside the 2 categories I'm going to talk about, but these are the main ones. So you have the Aedra and the Daedra. These literally mean ancestor and not our ancestor. These refer to the elves. The Aedra are or the 8 or 9 divines, depending on your belief system in Tamriel. The Aedra are the 9 or 8 divines. They are inhabited by planets, but they are the ancestors of the Mer. And they believe, a lot of them believe that their entire goal is to get back so that they can be with the Aedra again, can be Aedra again. Now, the Daedra are not our ancestors, but again, you get some splits in here because there's a lot of the Mer, of especially in the Bosmer clans and the Dunmer with the Dark Elves and Morrowind, who worship the Daedra. And I'm not going to get into this again. You can go to the other thing. But with this ideology, they serve as countries. Each race of elf has their own country per se. But in recent history, a faction within the Altmer or the High Elves has risen up called the Thalmor, which if you've played Skyrim, you know who the Thalmor are. And they believe in elven supremacy. So we talked about in Dragon Age and The Witcher, where elves are kind of in this oppressive category. Elder Scrolls takes Tolkien and takes it the other direction and says, what if elves are oppressors? Like they're more powerful, they're more akin to magic, but what if they are the oppressors? Yes, the elves, they can be very racist. And so the Thalmor, or the Altmeri Dominion, which is what the governing faction is, basically tries to conquer all of Tamriel. They outlaw the worship of Talos, or the 9th divine, and then they oppress, and then there's a civil war in Skyrim. Go play Skyrim. If you haven't, what have you been doing for 12 years? But yeah, so that's kind of the Elder Scrolls world, very briefly. And then I want to talk about Inheritance Cycle, which is basically just Tolkien elves. They're Tolkien elves, but I have there's a little difference with this that I want to tie into. Elves in Allagasia in the Inheritance Cycle are not native to the continent. They are not even even near the first race to set foot on that continent. The first race to set foot on the continent are the dwarves and the dragons. And so the elves come from over the sea, which is very similar to Tolkien's world, where they come across the sea and they land in Allagasia and they start settling and they get into a war with the dragons. And then there's a big thing. They have to create peace. They create the dragon riders, which bonds the race of elves forever with the race of dragons. So I think that's also one thing that makes Allagasian elves even more unique, is their relationship with dragons. Now, Dragon Age depending on what you believe about the Elven pantheon, they also have a relationship with dragons, but that also depends on what you believe about the pantheon. These elves in Allegasia are also ruled by a monarchy, but their monarchy is not an inherited position. So when a ruler dies, their children are not immediately taken over. They have to basically be appointed to that. One thing that I think that really hasn't risen up from Tolkien's world into the other universes is the elves' use of music and song and this kind of musical nature that the elves take on. That's central in Tolkien's universe, but we do see that in Allegasia, especially the use of song in magic. So in Allegasia, magic, all elves, so far as I'm connected, all elves in Allegasia can use magic.
I did not think that they could, but I thought it was just like a higher percentage of elves, but then they had, other, the inherent unique gifts of elves. But
Right.
I could also be wrong on that point.
According to the wiki, they are inherently magic. So the elves, they live in forests. They're very similar to this wood elves and all of that. But the way the magic system works is magic is based on a language that all the elves speak. You have to use the language to use magic. And so often elves will do really long spells in song because it's easier to remember the phrasing and everything like that. And so they use magic in song a lot. They also, in the ancient language, the language of magic, you can't lie. You can't say something that is untrue. So, like, saying half truths or saying something and meaning another is central in this elven culture. Uh, where no, they don't lie, but they might say something and mean the other. They're also vegetarians. They do not consume meat for a lot of reasons. They are atheistic. They don't believe in any kind of god. They're central relational to the dragon and they are immortal. But this is interesting because they are not inherently immortal. They are immortal because of the race's bond with the dragon. When they bond with the dragons, it makes the elves immortal, which I think is so interesting in this world comparing to the others, because in so many other of these worlds, the elves have kind of their immortality has diminished. They started super immortal and then it's diminished. Well, the in Palini's version, the elves started just as short lived as humans, but then they bonded with the dragons, and that affected their race on a fundamental level. There are little inconsistencies in the lore because humans aren't immortal unless they bond with a dragon. But yeah, that's the Elder Scrolls and the inheritance cycle.
Awesome. Thank you. So before we head to the mid break, does anybody have any follow-up questions about any of the different universes?
I have one thing that I forgot to hit on in the Tolkien segment that I've been reminded as we've been going, on the point of immortality, and what I was talking about, where the elves are tied to Arda, to the world. Um, Even when an elf in Tolkien's universe dies, they go to this place called the Halls of Mondos. It's kind of like an underworld sort of thing, but over time, they will be reincarnated into new bodies. So even in death, they cannot really escape the world, and they will eventually be released from the halls of Mondos back into the rest of the Undying realm. So it really is just like, hey, you guys are stuck here forever.
That just reminded me of something that I forgot or I misspoke about. The material plane in Elder Scrolls is called Mundus. It is not Nirn is the planet that they exist on. Still kind of thing, but when you said that, it reminded me. Oh, Mundus. That's a thing in the Elder Scrolls world.
I just
Cool.
wanted to say there's a lot of stuff out there that D&D nerds listening to. I did not say, but I'm leaving it for discussion. So leave it there. We're going to talk about that stuff after the mid-break stuff. I didn't forget they don't sleep. All right, calm down.
All right. Well, let's get into the mid break and then we'll come back and have all those discussions.
So you like to read? What's wrong with that? It's frivolous. There are more important things for me to do.
That's just her favorite.
Nobody asked you, Tevinter.
I couldn't finish the last one you lent me. I actually feel dumber for having tried.
It's literature. Smutty literature. Whatever you do, don't tell Varric.
No offense, but might I try? I've got a quick hand, after all. Ha, let's see. Oh, when was the last time I slipped my hand into some dark hole? I remember. Long story, that.
You hurt my head sometimes, Solus.
Yes, I have been known to do that.
Welcome to the middle of the show. This is where we talk about all of the things that have to do with the podcast and not the lore. So first and foremost, thank you to all of our patrons. We have several patrons that we always shout out in the mid-break of every episode. So thank you to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. And thank you to our Nug King patron, Lewis H. We love you guys so much. And thank you to all of our patrons. And if you want to support the Dragon Age Lorecast, Patreon is the best way to do it. So hop on over there. And then the next best way to support us is to leave us a rating or a review. You can do that literally anywhere. And if you are kind and leave us 5 stars, we will read it out on the show. And then the last thing I have to tell you is that today is Dragon Age Day. If you're listening to this, we have a giveaway going on today only. I mean, I hope you're listening to this the day it premieres, but if you're listening afterwards, the giveaway is over. But if you're listening on Dragon Age Day 2023, we do have a giveaway going on social media, our website, and on Discord. So definitely hop on one of those 3 places, join the Discord. You can get some really awesome merch as it relates to Dragon Age. So let's get back into the show.
Abominations are always so awkward at family reunions. Have you ever seen an abomination? They are ugly.
Dorian, those words you say, what do they mean?
What, you mean like mendicant? Ultimatum?
No arse when you're mad. Pishanti Kothas. You're swearing, I know it.
Vishanta Kafas. It's Tavine, relics of the old tongue. We still use the colourful phrases.
And it means what?
Literally, you shit on my tongue.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
All right. So this half of the episode, we're going to be just basically discussing similarities, differences, maybe fighting and arguing about it too. But, you know, it'll be fun. Yeah. So let's just get into our discussion. We can just kind of open it up. Anybody can talk about what kind of similarities or differences that are important. Like, obviously we could go through, well, this one's different this way, but like what themes, I guess, do you see across the different franchises that are important to call out in terms of similarities and differences?
So the first one that comes to mind, I'm not entirely inherently a genius when it comes to elves across the franchises, but I don't think there's another race of elves that don't sleep across the franchises.
Falcon elves don't sleep.
That's what I thought. I thought they didn't sleep, and I was like, I'm not 100%.
Inheritance elves don't sleep. They have a state of dreams, which is very similar to the meditation. Is that what it's called?
Yep, meditation. Yep.
Dragon Age elves love to sleep. Sleeping's one of their favorite things.
I mean, fair.
People.
They also love to sleep eternally. So
With Temeria.
yeah.
Wow. See, that's the first thing that jumps to my mind is sleep, because it's so great that we have such a difference between all of these. Because yes, D&D elves, they meditate. They meditate for 4 hours. They're like, yeah, I'm just gonna chill here for a little bit. You guys do whatever you want. I'm just gonna chill for a bit. And it's gonna be like a full rest for me. Like, and then Tolkien elves, they don't need to sleep either. But then you have other ones where they're like, oh no, I have to sleep. I need my beauty rest.
Yeah, I also think there's this idea across a lot of the different fandoms that I guess it's more like being indigenous to the land, that they were here first, or at least one of the first ones. I mean, Dragon Age, The Witcher, Tolkien, D&D, like all of these have this kind of idea there. So I think that's something that we share. Actually, I don't remember if that applies to Elder Scrolls or not. So that's definitely an important one that I kind of thought of, as well as, especially between D&D and Dragon Age. Like, I feel like there's a lot of similarities there, because there's the magical superiority, there's the loss of the homeworld, there's the shortening of the lifespan, and there's the loss of magic. All of those things are the same, and I think there's some of that applies to The Witcher as well.
Oh yeah.
Yep,
Big
definitely.
time. Meanwhile, everybody else gets to keep their magic, and they get to keep all that stuff. Thanks a lot.
Ben, this is a Witcher question. Can elves even potentially join the, like, basically the magical fraternities that exist in Witcher?
Yes, they can. They can. There has been reports and like actual members of the, like, one of the sorceresses for the Lodge of Sorceresses is an elf. And there has been some elves that go through the Brotherhood and the School of Aretuza. Also, the School of Aretuza is built on the blood of elves, essentially. So it's kind of like, not so great.
I just love the idea that they're like, hey, guys, you can come to the school. It's built on the bodies of your ancestors, but you're welcome.
Essentially, yeah. Now, there's not many elves that practice magic by the time that we get in the books, so there's very few. But yeah, it's kind of ironic. It's like, yep, no, I'm good.
Gosh, I know that, like, people like Aragorn can use the semblance of magic in Tolkien's world, but like he has like a special lineage. Can anyone outside of like the Maiar and the elves use magic?
It's unclear based on Tolkien's school and system of magic. For example, I know Tolkien talked about how the Mouth of Sauron, who just makes that very, very brief appearance, he allegedly was like a dark sorcerer. Or in The Hobbit, when they talk about the necromancer in Dol Guldur, they thought he was just a human sorcerer. But then we never actually ever see anybody else using this grand magic to the point where it's kind of like, why would your mind automatically assume that this is a human when hardly anybody other humans can use magic, and not, Sauron or somebody of that equal nature? In my personal opinion, I'll just kind of say no, because even like elven magic, it's not the same level of magic as like Gandalf. The only person who could really go toe to toe with Gandalf maybe would be Galadriel. But also because it kind of goes back to, like, you're talking about the equivalent of angels fighting flesh and bone. So it's like only the very best of the best are going to have any comparable power scaling.
What about appearances? It seems like across the board, all elves in the franchise have soft, that graceful, that elegant, appearance. I don't think anybody. Yeah, pointy ears is definitely on the list. Okay, but it just seems like all of them are pretty.
So I have heard things basically of Lord of the Rings TikTok that there's no like textual evidence that Tolkien elves have pointy ears.
I'll have to go back and reread, but I'm not so convinced by that.
The bus, you're being thrown under it.
Just the same way that, like, in the books, they're like, oh, Legolas never speaks to Frodo ever. But then, like, Tolkien spends pages on pages just describing geography. He also doesn't ever talk about anyone taking a poop, but they all took a poop. So, like, we can assume they talked to each other. We can assume they had pointy ears.
I Googled it. According to the OneRing.net, Tolkien described, he never actually described elves, but he described a hobbit as having ears that are pointy and elvish. So it's kind of like an extrapolation that, well, if a hobbit has pointy ears that's elvish, that means elves have to have pointy ears too. But I would also add, Aaron, back to your original question, like elves being pretty, I think Dragon Age might be the one where you could make an argument that might be different, because especially in Dragon Age 2, like with the eye thing, like they're so bug-eyed, that some people probably do think it's pretty, but it is a little bit like, why do you look like that? Yes. Alien is the best word for it.
You ever
Yeah.
tried to make, without mods, has anyone made a pretty elf in Elder Scrolls?
Yes.
No.
Fair.
I immediately deleted the character because it was boring.
Especially not in Oblivion.
Now, I will... No, Oblivion, God, no. I will say Witcher elves aren't necessarily inherently like beautiful or stunning or anything like that. At least the Anshe, the ANL, yes. The ones from a different world, from like a different universe, different world, yes. The Anshe that live on the continent of the world of The Witcher, essentially just like any other people, they can look whatever way possible.
Also want to point out that in Inheritance specifically, only one person ever calls an elf beautiful, and that's the main character because he's infatuated with the other woman in the story. And then there is, well, okay, I know Cash is going to be there. He's going to be like, well, what about Bloodgarm? Like, let's talk about Bloodgarm. He looks like a wolf and has altered his appearance to do that. And he produces a pheromone that makes women fall in love with him. So there's my answer to that.
Who's to say?
Are Inheritance elves pretty? We don't know. Because the only movie we got of them shows them
trash.
as looks like just a regular, every other bitch out there,
Okay, so just to move us along a little bit, the next question I have says, does one specific fandom lore universe inform another or multiple others? And I have a note in the notes that says, all caps, Austin needs to go before Collcashins on this question. So why don't you just go right ahead, Austin?
So the reason I have this is because Collcashins texted me other day and to say that he needed me to say on the podcast the allegation the Inheritance elves are that Paolini heavily borrowed from Tolkien to create his elves. And here you go, Collcashins. Yes, that is true. But I wanted to talk about, of all of our fandoms, Paolini is one of the only ones that has ever been accused of plagiarizing. And my question to that, like the question I want to say to that is like, for your philosophy people, can Aristotle plagiarize Plato?
Like, where's the line?
Like, where's the line of this? Of Paolini lists Tolkien as his influences. He never like comes up when he creates the world and says like, look at this world or elves that I've created out of nothingness of my mind. He says, no, I was heavily influenced by all of these different stories and fantasy stories that came before me. He was also 17 when he wrote the book, and what 17-year-old is going to be like, come up with elves that isn't inspired by Lord of the Rings? Yes, he starts off with a similar premises, but for me at least, especially with the bond with like dragons, mainly because dragons in Tolkien's world are almost exclusively evil. The other things about how Paolini's magic system interacts with elves is very different than Lord of the Rings. And so I would say he's heavily influenced by Tolkien. Yes. Is there one specific fandom that informs the others? I think in this podcast we've answered yes. Like Tolkien is obviously the one that informs every single one of them because he's the OG. He's the one who did it. He's the one who took all of these myths and stories from different mythologies and adds them, in there. And like when D&D comes around, they start influencing a little more like Celtic influence with the addition of fairies and the fae and all of that. And just all of these are representations of things that our real world cultures have come up with or have in their mythologies or religions and things like that. So I would just say, like, are we plagiarizing or are we just influenced because we are humans and we all tell stories in a similar way.
I think that's fair. I also think, though, when you have a book, it's a little bit more going to be under scrutiny versus a video game when you are taking inspiration. And so I think that's part of the reason why there are the plagiarism accusations against Paolini for his inspiration from Tolkien and his universe. So I think that being the primary thing I want to say, but also, it's harder, I think, to make a plagiarism accusation with completely different mediums, like a video game versus a book. I feel like it's really a lot harder to compare that. But at the same time, especially when you see D&D and Tolkien, like these are the most prolific because they are written down, and it's not just like a video game that, oh well, it's 15 years old now, nobody has a console to play it anymore. Dragon Age Origins remaster when I won't get us off topic anyway. So I just think that D&D and Tolkien's universe, like both of them, because they are so prolific, they impact just all of the other fandoms so much more than, say, The Witcher impacts Dragon Age.
Well, if I may add something here, I feel like with Tolkien's universe, these are elves. With the D&D universe, they turn around and went, okay, these are elves, but these are also other types of elves. Oh, also, we have this other type of elf. They expanded on what it meant to be an elf. They didn't say all elves were the same. I mean, you have elves in here that they literally can transform into wolves. That's their whole premise in life. You have some elves that are part demons. You have other elves that are part celestial beings. You have this grand deviation of what it means to be an elf in D&D, which I think is where it actually went and influenced more. Because other franchises were like, well, we can have different types of elves now. We don't just have to have the bog standard box set elf. We can expand on this and create something different. But it can still be associated with that same elf everyone knows from the Tolkien universe.
I'll just add on there that I think Tolkien created the archetype, and that using the archetype is not in and of itself plagiarism, and it is developing on this point. And that I do think that it is unfair, the criticisms that have been leveled against Paolini on the similarities between his elves and the Tolkien elves. And I think even that other fandoms might have gone in the opposite direction for the purpose of subversion to distinguish themselves more, where you go from elves being, graceful, angelic, divine, sublime. And then it's like, oh, you all are at the bottom of the social ladder, and you are second class citizens in the loosest sense of the word within wider society, because we want to shake things up and not be like Tolkien. And it's like, thank you for introducing racism into this fantasy world when my whole purpose of turning to you was escapism from reality. Thank you.
Okay, so Cash, that's a great point, and it totally leads into the next question, which is, where do you see problematic tropes and interpretations when it comes to elves?
Let me get you started with D&D.
We'll go right ahead.
So, holy cow. Okay, you want to talk about problematic? Wizards of the Coast has had their fair share of problems. Okay, period. Dot. From hashtag D&D problems, whiz probs. We're not here to talk about all the ridiculous antics that they try to pull all the time. No, we're here to talk about the first one on everybody's mind, which was the drow. Since the dawning of 3.5, when we had Dritz, the most infamous drow that there ever was in the D&D franchise, everybody wanted to be a drow. Before then, drows were just common household enemies that no one cared about. We can enslave them, we can murder them, we can burn down their entire villages. They're bad guys. No one cares. Dritz changed everything, because Dritz is a drow who's inherently good. He's a drow ranger who travels all over and saves innocent people. And everybody's like, oh, wait, so there can be good drow. Ooh, this is a problem. Now everyone started to see the actual racism that was in D&D. And they started to pick it out of every other single individual race as well. Wow, the dwarves are always treated like crap. Oh my God, the bird people, they're always looked at like they're lesser beings. Go on, so on and so forth. And it was because of the drow. Then I believe when that started happening with D&D, it started happening with a lot of other elven, different branches. So people started to really look at the games and the books that they love. I went, oh, actually, this is kind of bad. So thanks to D&D, in a way, everybody started noticing the bad things about the fandoms, and they went, ooh, racism, bad. It's all over the place in this. Ugh.
That people look down on the drow, and they do that the Eldrin were reintroduced as a race, because historically, particularly in the summer court of the Fae, they don't think any other elves are elves.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And so it's so interesting that you introduce all of these things, and it's similar in the Elder Scrolls with the Altmer being that, but there's so much even left over. There's so much racism, in universe racism, not just analogy, in universe people being racist towards the Dunmer, the Dark Elves, across Skyrim, across Cyrodiil, even in Morrowind itself, their homeland.
Mm-hmm. I feel like once the drow got pointed out, and they started, Wizards of the Coast started to try to backtrack, and they were like, oh, but look at this other racist. Look at this other. This is when all the franchises started to purposely include that style of racism like they did in the Elder Scrolls universe and everything else. They included this for, let's face it, the story, which we really didn't need. In all honesty, we didn't need the racism driven force. We still liked your story even when you didn't have that. But they saw that as I feel like a lot of the franchises saw that as a chance to jump onto a bandwagon, because there's this thing called, no publicity is bad publicity. So they all were like, okay, well, Wizard of the Coast is getting an awful lot of front page articles right now. Let's jump on that bandwagon. We'll figure it out the rest of the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, because in Dragon Age, elves are people are racist against elves. And unfortunately, some of the writers made some mistakes in interviews and speaking about elves, comparing them to indigenous people or Jewish people. So then when you look at it in context of the games, it's is this what they think about indigenous people or Jewish people? Is that, because then the metaphor becomes real, as opposed to, oh, this fictional race is being treated badly. It's this fictional race who is representative, or the writers say, are based upon these real cultures. Now we're treating them badly, and it is not okay. No. And I think hopefully, we'll see less and less of that, as fans start wanting it to be different. But it's disappointing, and especially if you grow up with a media and then you realize, ooh, that was ugly. It can be, it's a hard shift to make, but it's good to kind of gain that perspective and to be critical of the things that you enjoy, and point out those kind of biases that were written into the games or the books or the media.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. So racism, bad, period. But in the way of the world of The Witcher works, how it is set up as a dark fantasy, it does make sense. Now, the elves in the Witcher universe are based off the light elves in Norse mythology. So that's where they're all based from and everything. But with that, being as a dark fantasy it makes sense with the world. It was also, the series as a whole started in the 80s, and it was Polish only. It was only in Polish, it was never even translated into English until 2007 when the first Witcher game dropped in English format by CDPR. So by the time like the books came to English, the games came out, it was just set about the world, and like the author himself is Polish. They're based off light elves. It is what it is. It's part of the world. It's dark. It's evil. Nothing is good in the Witcher universe. There is no happy ending.
That being said, it's set in that specific universe. That's what we learn to expect. When you walk into a high fantasy kind of environment, you don't expect to see that level of dark hatred. You know, you're walking in, I'm going to go save the princess. You know, you're walking into this fantasy setting that's supposed to be higher tempoed, higher, enlightened. It's supposed to be a different setting altogether. You're not expecting to walk into this dark, dreary nastiness. I mean, there's a reason I didn't bring the Warhammer 40K universe today. It's very
That's
bad.
It's
dark. Nothing but bad. Even the elves in that are awful. But again, that is the universe which you come to expect. You don't walk into that game expecting sunshine and rainbows. You expect death, destruction, darkness, just awful. Yeah. But again, that's the tempo that these creators set. And when they deviate from it, I think that's what upsets us. When you deviate from that tempo, that's all right. Now you're crossing a line. We didn't sign up for this.
And I also think it kind of going back to Allison, your point, like it's not really about, I mean, it is about the lore specifically, but I think the issue comes when we have the writers or whomever is in charge externally outside of the lore making proclamations about, oh, well, we were inspired by this race and this specific event. That is the issue, I think, for me, at least the biggest issue. And I think Dragon Age especially is guilty of this. And I think it can be very alienating to whoever is part of that group, whether it be Indigenous or Jewish or Black people or whomever the case may be. It can be very alienating to go into a game and play it and love it. And then you're like diving into external media and you're like, oh, they said this. And then that kind of ruins, I think, the whole experience. And so I just wanted to add that on. Austin, yeah, go ahead.
I just gonna add on that and like kind of the example of like if you're still having a hard time with like what we specifically we're talking about. So BioWare has come out and said that like a lot of what the elves are like in Dragon Age are based on indigenous communities, Celtic communities, Jewish communities. I mean, the alienages are almost a one-for-one analogy of Nazi Germany ghettos. Like it is. That's what it is. When you do that, when you say this is that, and then you look at the elf's physique and they're short, and they have big noses, like it now comes in of like you're now using real life stereotypes that have been harmful to this group of people to portray this instead of embracing us and pointing to a point of like showing all of this. And it's even to a point of like if you take Mass Effect for example, and like there's species racism that exists from other species, but they don't try to say, oh, these are like representing this people. It's just a representation of oppression and racism in the universe. And I think that's the line that we have, that as when we're critiquing these we have to dance. Is this like taking real life experiences that people and applying harmful stereotypes to it, or is it just showing us our own things that we can say, okay, humans are really crappy to the Solarians, we can apply that to how we treat our other humans on Earth, versus like elves are inspired by Jewish people and they have big noses.
And I think that comes back to the point I made when I was talking about it originally. They, instead of just leaving it at the elves are oppressed, they then went back and said, well, they're oppressed because they were oppressors and now they've been taken down a notch and this is kind of their, justice. So instead of, they don't get a happy ending. They don't just get to be elves. They have to find out that their entire mythos was a lie. everything they believed in is a lie. They're they're the villains of history. It's just not a good look. It's just not a good way to tell the story. And Dragon Age Origins started out as dark. It was a kind of a dark fantasy, and they shifted gears, but somehow, I don't know, it just didn't translate well. And again, those comparisons to real life people is really what they shot themselves in the foot with that. And that's the problem, the biggest problem anyway.
Oh, well, all I'm going to say is the prime example of what Austin was saying with D&D is the Drow originally were a problem because everybody loved them. With the newer races that have become problematic in D&D, it is because of the fact that they've referenced actual races of people in real life to influence, quote unquote, these designs. That's not okay. We were upset with the Drow because we wanted to play Drow. So just give us our Drow. That's honestly what everybody was upset about. Why you gotta hate on a whole race? We want to be those guys. With these newer ones that are coming out and they talk about, oh, this is influenced by this race and this race. Stop right there. You're being you're being a dick. I'm just gonna say you're being a dick. Okay, nobody likes you. Stop it. That is exactly what we're referencing here. You did it originally. It was fantasy. You fell in love with this character and you changed it a little bit to make us happy. The other one, you're just being a dick. Just being a racist dick.
End of discussion.
Done.
But no, that is a great mic drop moment. So I'm just going to move us on to our last question, which is I think the eternal question here, and that's why do you think elves are so popular across so many different fandoms? I mean, look at all of the most popular characters in our fandoms, like Solus. Very, very popular. He's up there. Astarion right now in Baldur's Gate 3. Like, elves are so popular, and I'm curious on why you guys think that is.
I have one thing to say.
Go ahead,
There's
Ben.
not popular elves in The Witcher. They're all complete a-holes.
Okay.
All the ones
Does
that Geralt
Ciri
meet at
count?
least.
Does
Okay,
Ciri
she has.
count?
Okay,
Gotcha.
that's fair. She has elven blood, but she's still
Boom.
human.
Listen, half elf.
She's not even a half
elf.
elf.
Half elf. Canon. Done. No,
Just because she's got some mythical god ancestor blood.
I think reason elves are such a chosen popular race is because it reflects, most of the time it reflects what we as humans want out of our fantasy. We want to be able to, okay, we're going to jump it back to Legend of Zelda here real quick. Link. Okay, the reason Shigeru Miyamoto chose Link is because it was a reference between a link between the player and the game. Hence his name. This is the same thing we have with our fantasy. Elves are just human enough for us to find similarities, but they take us into a fantasy setting. They give us those long, pointy ears. They don't look weird. They look elegant. They're beautiful. Everybody wants to be beautiful. I haven't met a single human in this world that doesn't want to be beautiful. You already are. If you're listening, you are. But that's what everybody pines for. And everybody wants to feel powerful and magical. And when you play fantasy and you experience fantasy, you want to be pulled into it. And when you try to play a race like a giant walking, talking elephant, it's cool, but there's just something missing. With an elf, you feel human enough that you can get drawn deep into the fantasy. You can experience the fantasy on a personal level, and you can still get what you're wanting out of it. You're wanting that power, that change, that you're just wanting to be happy in a nutshell. And that is the most, personally, that is the race that allows you to be pulled in the most, I believe.
I really think that's like just the point of like why we play fantasy. And we're attracted to things that both are similar and remove us from a reality. And so I think it's why like casters, especially in role-playing games like D&D, tend to be some of the more popular. I say this as a martial class main. Casters are the most popular ones, but we want that embrace of magic. And most of the time when we go into a world like a role-playing game, we're like, no, I want to use the cool powers. I mean, And this is the right thing. Like, we do talk about Star Wars a little bit. I'm just going to briefly talk about Star Wars, and I'll get on Assassin's Creed so I can hit all of my fandoms that I talk about. Who doesn't want to use the Force? Who doesn't want to use magic? Who doesn't want power? You want to feel that power. And like, yeah, we have opportunities, but let's take SWOTOR for example. I mean, if you play the MMO, most of you started either as a Sith playthrough or a Jedi playthrough. There are not a lot of people I know. Aaron might be the first who started as like a Republic soldier playthrough. But like, you want to have that power, you want to do the mystical thing, you want to go in and be cool and use force lightning and shoot fireballs and use Misty Step, which is my favorite. So
No, I think those are all really important points to bring up, and I think that the we want to have the power, whatever the special power is. I think that is definitely up there for sure. But are there other thoughts anybody wanted to add about this last question?
The only other thing I can really think of is just the connection that elves have to our real myths and you know, across cultures. They come from us. And so I think probably maybe more so than some of the other species in these types of media, you know, people believe in elves, you know, in different cultures. They believe in the fae and kind of the trickery. And so yes, it's morphed, but I do think that part of the reason that we're so connected to elves is that they come from us. You know, they come from our myths and our lore as humans. And so I think that also makes the stories relatable as well.
I really appreciate that and completely agree. And I think it's a great place to end our discussion. So I'm going to close it off. Thank you all for being here so much. And we'll go around the room and let you guys plug whatever podcast streams, shows, whatever you're doing that you want to plug, go for it.
Yeah, so you can find me on 4 shows. The Holocron Histories, where I co-host with Austin / Teacup here. I also host the Final Fantasy Lorecast, the Wizarding World Lorecast, and the Witcher Lorecast, all part of the Robots Radio Network. And I also live stream 3 of those shows on my own Twitch channel at twitch.tv/BenofTemeria. I am so close. By the time you hear this, I might be affiliated. I don't know, but I'm trying to get affiliated, so help me out. When this drops, go and listen to the Witcher Lorecast. I will just tease it out. It's going to be a very, very, very special episode. You might hear a certain voice on the show.
Okay, that's very intriguing. You'll have to post in the Discord and remind everybody.
Oh boy, do I ever! Y'all ready for these 19?
Go ahead.
No, I have tons of pods. I'm just gonna rattle them off. If it's a part of your fandom and you love it, just come listen, come join us. So first off, right off the bat, D&D. We have the Fumbling 4 and the Allmightycrit, a comedy live play D&D podcast. If you like ridiculous antics and tomfoolery and talking cats that piss you off, just come listen to the Fumbling 4. Right on that TTRPG train, we have the Call of Cthulhu Mythos Mysteries live play podcast. If creepy's your name, this is your game. If you love yourself some futuristic fantasy, crazy, dark, yeah, if you love that, then Cyberpunked is your TTRPG of choice that we do. And then, much like you guys, we have quite a few lore casts as well. Resident Evil Lorecast, you can come get your all your RE needs. The Legend of Zelda Lorecast. The newest 2 we have, however, we have the Warhammer Lorecast, where myself and my co-host, The Naked Mango, that's right, you heard that right, we are discussing all things Warhammer 40k right now, and he's schooling me on it because I don't know anything except for it's dark and terrible, and I'm getting PTSD just listening to it. And finally, we have our Kingdom Hearts Lorecast. Just started raring to go, just in time for the new mobile game to come out. So if you have any of those that pique your interest, come hang out with us. Come join us. We're on the Robots Radio podcast. And as for streaming, I have a special announcement as well. This month for the Fumbling 4 stream, we are doing a Thankful for You stream. We're doing Thankful for all you fans, all you listeners. We're gaming with you. Come out, have fun with us, join us, hang out. It's a good, fun time. We always get up to ridiculous antics and tomfoolery. But yeah, come join us on the Allmightycrit Twitch channel. Hang out, come see us. So that's all I got for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Allison.
I don't have any shows.
That's okay.
I do. I am very active on the app formerly known as Twitter. As Allisondraste, I tweet about video games. And right now it's Baldur's Gate, but Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Cyberpunk, Fallout. I talk about all those things. Also have a Tumblr, same username. I talk about the same stuff. So follow me there. I like to talk.
Awesome. Thank you. And Collcashins.
I do not have anything to plug except, as always, the Cup server on Discord. If you're listening to this, hopefully you are a member of the Discord. If you are not yet a member, please go join. It is a fantastic and wonderful place, and we'd love to have you. And it's nothing but laughs and fun discussions about fandoms.
I wanted to add before we wrap up, Aaron, you could not have picked a more convoluted lore cast to do than Kingdom Hearts.
Oh, it's bad.
And this is why we never talk about Kingdom Hearts in the Final Fantasy lore cast.
Listen, I am gonna solve this. This is my mission, okay? On top of making content that makes you smile, which is the number one mission in my life, number two is to finally solve the Linguini puzzle that is the Kingdom Hearts lore cast. It's the lore is completely convoluted and it goes everywhere, but I'm gonna fix it and I'm gonna solve it. You watch.
But lastly, that is the wrap up of the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find me and Shelby again on the Assassin's Creed Lorecast. And then, so other than that, thank you all for being here and coming on the show to talk about elves. Happy Dragon Age Day, all you Dragon Age fans. Thank you for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Do you love Dragon Age? Have you always wanted to learn more about its vast world and detailed lore? Are you still attached to your hero of Ferelden, even a decade after Dragon Age Origins came out? Or maybe you're a newer fan, still discovering a new tidbit or quest every day.
Well, either way, the Dragon Age Lorecast is the podcast for you. I'm Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm Shelby, also known as Shecup.
And come and join us as we embark on a journey to explore and discover all things Dragon Age.
We'll discuss all kinds of topics, from Lyrium to the Chantry and the great mysteries of the old gods, and even more that even you BioWare superfans might not know about.
So come and listen on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. And always remember,
swooping